Tonight, I'm joined by Dan Diker, president of the Jerusalem Center for Security and Foreign Affairs, and former AP chief Dan Perry, to unpack what it all means. You know, I want to start with a question about the most recent post by U.S. President Donald Trump on his Truth Social platform. He is condemning France for not allowing U.S. planes to land and refuel while they were carrying military equipment over to Israel. And following that, Secretary of State Rubio responded by saying that potentially after this war, the United States will re-examine the NATO partnerships.
The European position is absolutely craven and in some ways pitiful. They have as much of an interest as the U.S. and as Israel does in not only the Iranian regime being dissuaded from its various forms of misbehavior, but that the regime should fall, basically. They should be on side in this war, and Trump is right to be frustrated on one hand. However, as often happens in geopolitics, things are a little bit more complex. The Europeans themselves are at least as frustrated with Trump as he is with them, because they've just endured almost a year and a half of his disrespect, indifference, and insults, which have been needless and which in some cases have been shocking. The very NATO alliance that the U.S. now wants to re-examine was completely rattled a few months ago when Trump threatened to invade Denmark, essentially, in order to seize Greenland. The Europeans were stunned by this. The constant attacks on them for their supposed civilizational decline, for NATO being at various points in Trump's view obsolete. Clearly they're very upset. And the December national security strategy walked away from parts of the alliance, disassociated the U.S. from democracy promotion, and was an absolute shock to the system. So from the European perspective, it's a little bit rich that Trump now comes to them hat in hand and will draw conclusions from their lack of cooperation. But since it really is complex, at the same time, I would have hoped the Europeans would get over it just in this one instance. But I do understand that they're frustrated not just by Trump's overall attitude towards them, but the fact that they weren't consulted when Trump launched the war. That said, the bottom line is, of course, they should help because they have at least as big an interest as the U.S. does. But we see here the price of Trump's purposeful rattling of this alliance, and I think all sides should take a deep breath and reconsider.
Well, and certainly Trump has a record for having quite a strong rhetoric right now. Trump is also, if we want to talk about Iran's attack on our energy infrastructure, for example, Trump is saying that there will be a response by the United States, that there will be some kind of attack for Iran's attack on Haifa coming very soon. And yet at the same time, Dan Diker, maybe you can respond to this. The president is also talking about these negotiations. If there is an attack on some kind of energy infrastructure in Iran, what do you envision that attack will look like?
Well, that kind of speculation can get us into dangerous waters. But Mayan, it's a very fair question. I think that we need to look at what we do know as opposed to what we might think might happen. It's clear if we look at the ground that the president has ordered thousands and thousands of special forces Marines that are here in the Middle East, that are in place, and others that are just about to arrive here. The United States has a massive power projection of some 70,000 troops and, many warships and 4 or 5 different aircraft carriers. Probably some 40% of the American military might is focused here in the Middle East. And President Trump, as only President Trump can do, is issuing conflicting messages to keep everybody confused, particularly the Iranian regime.
Now, the question that I have for you is, can the U.S. really negotiate while also preparing to strike such a serious way at the same time? Doesn't that look kind of awkward to the global community and certainly to Iran?
It not only can, these are interrelated processes. Obviously, the threats to take action are meant to achieve leverage in the negotiations. And I find it very difficult to believe that the Iranians, who in public at least deny that they're even negotiating, are going to capitulate on any of these points anytime soon, because unfortunately, the dynamic that has been allowed to emerge is that they feel like they're winning, and they think it's reasonable for them to assume they can outlast the patience of the West. And therefore, even though my inclination is not to recommend escalation and to seek an off-ramp somehow that is helpful, I think in this case I have to suspect very strongly that Trump is looking for a way to deliver a more clear message to the Iranians that they are wrong in their assessment that they have all this leverage, and that could take the form of actual troops on Kharg Island or the other islands, or maybe even, if they want to really deliver a symbolic message, and this is more dangerous, seizing Iranian mainland territory across from Oman at the narrowest point of the Strait of Hormuz. Obviously, if you're on the mainland, you become more vulnerable to insurgencies, to terrestrial attacks, and so forth. But I have to think that some version of American escalation is coming, and the threat needs to be credible, which is why he's making it in public. I also would not be hugely surprised to see Trump and the U.S. declare a complete oil embargo on Iran. The crazy thing is that even though the world right now, and this mainly affects directly Asia, is not getting oil out of the Persian Gulf, Iran's oil exports have risen. And this is not right. This equation is unbalanced. And of course, the fear, and this is the fear that was paralyzing for the Biden administration over the years, and Trump may be falling into the same trap, is that if he takes direct measures against, to limit totally the Iranian export of oil, that'll cause a spike in prices. But you know what? Markets may conclude that that could speed up the end of the war, and that itself could be a reassuring factor. In short, I'm not surprised to see both threats and claims of negotiation, and I would be very surprised to see the kind of Iranian capitulation that is necessary to end the war with a positive narrative for the West and for Israel without some version of further escalation.
Yeah, 100%. And we're certainly hearing that, the American people are saying, well, we could suffer for the short term, but certainly not for the long term when it comes to those oil prices. And if that would speed up the end of the war and potentially give a win, without question. And also here in Israel, where the rockets, the sirens continue to hit down here in the country, all throughout the center of the country. Just in the last day, we saw a lot of damage and some injuries. Now, Passover, of course, starts tonight or tomorrow night at sundown. Is there any chance at all that this war with Iran could realistically quiet down even more by Wednesday night? Or should Israelis really prepare for sirens and more terror through the holiday? Dan Diker, what do you think?
45 and what Imperial Japan
say, Dan Diker. The regime understands that the
flag coming out of the Iranian regime, they either will die as shahidim, as martyrs, or they believe they'll win as victors. It's a religiously fueled commitment, and that is one of the reasons they're unable to see what even the Nazis saw at the end in 1945 and what Imperial Japan saw when there was unconditional surrender in World War II. No such thing happening with the Iranian regime.
Well, unfortunately, the difference is, and I've thought a lot about this, you have certain kind of dictatorships that are really dependent on one person who's sui generis, and if you eliminate that one person, then the regime understands that the game is up, and that was obviously the case with the Nazi regime, and it's occurred throughout history at various times. Sadly, for the rest of the world and for the region, for the people of Iran, that is not the case with the Iranian regime, where you have at least 1 million people and probably more who are totally committed, and as you say, Dan Diker, fanatical. And for this reason, I try to be an optimist, but I also try to be a realist. I would expect Iranian attacks on Seder night and throughout the week. There's no reason to think they're going to respect the holiday. That's close to absurd. I do agree that something has to happen, however, in Iran, and I have a lot of conversations, some public, some not, with Iranian opposition diaspora leaders, and are so optimistic that eventually the Iranian people will rise up. I think at some point that needs to be part of the plan. In other words, we don't have unlimited time. And the scenario has to be that, since we all know that this regime is best replaced, first and foremost, for the people of Iran. And replacing the regime cannot happen purely through aerial bombardment, probably, especially when they're this fanatical. And therefore, an internal process needs to amass. And I would welcome not only subterranean talks with the Iranian military and even maybe parts of the Revolutionary Guard to offer them amnesty, to offer them exit, to offer them the ability to keep their plunder, maybe, but as long as they step aside and betray the regime, and mainly to make clear two things. One, if the war pauses, let's say, and wars can pause. The previous 12-day war paused, basically. And And the Iranians the Iranian regime lives another day. We have to make clear that we will protect the people who then go out into the streets. And there are plans for people to go out into the streets. We have to present a plan as to how we're going to prevent another massacre. And at the same time, on the carrot side, the West and the entire West, and this time, not just Trump, who runs a weirdly monarchic operation in the US, but the West, NATO, the EU, everyone needs to get together and present the Iranians as a people and as a transition government, hopefully, with a whole series of carrots as to what they're going to get if they somehow compel the regime to surrender or help defeat the regime. And that would include, obviously, an unfreezing of all assets, an end to all sanctions, and a maximal welcoming into the family of nations.
Well, and Dan, I think it's pretty obvious that that's what the United States and everybody else will want to be giving to a new Iranian regime if it is a peaceful regime. But I think, as you and Dan both said, with a fanatical regime, you can't really expect that it's just going to come down, even if the people go to the streets, and that you're going to be able to prevent some kind of massacre.
Note that it's not articulated. Trump is really good at making threats, but an eloquent articulation of the unbelievable upside that the Iranian people and the region and the world stand to receive if only everyone can unite against the regime. And I would loop back to the beginning, including the Europeans, presenting a positive narrative and not just a negative one can create momentum and can influence geopolitics.
The Saudis will go with the winner, and the cost to the Saudis can be normalization, and part of the cost of normalization, even though there's a lot of upside for the Saudis, is an east-west pipeline that would go across Saudi Arabia, avoid the Straits of Hormuz altogether, and go up through the canal and into Ashkelon, Haifa ports, making Israel a main global energy stop on the way to the West.
And I would just add that is very much in line with the several-year-old initiative called IMEC, which envisions India being part of a grand corridor, not just of land transport, but in general, a corridor going through the Arabian Peninsula, circumnavigating the Persian Gulf entirely, through Israel, onto Europe, envisioning regional infrastructure integration. It could be spectacular, and this, weirdly, could accelerate it.
I really want to thank both Dans for being here tonight, and I want to wish all of our viewers a safe and pleasant evening.